As far as I'm concerned, as long as that same respect and recognition is not shown toward every one of our people in this country, it doesn't exist for me. And during the few moments that we have left, we want to have just an off-the-cuff chat between you and me. Us. We want to talk right down to earth in a language that everybody here can easily understand.
Welcome back to another episode of The Malcolm Effect, and my guest today is someone who you would have heard on The Malcolm Effect, but goes way beyond that. Someone who there's very few scholars that I trust and very few scholars that I am able to not just follow quite intensely and listen to, but also I feel very comfortable in wherever stage someone is in within their faith, whether that makes them someone who's thinking about Islam, someone newly become Muslim, someone who's been Muslim for their whole entire life. I feel very comfortable in recommending Shaykh Khaled, Abou El-Fadl. So welcome back to the Malcolm Effect, and how are you, Shaykh?
Alhamdulillah, I'm so happy to be with you. It's Mamadou. It's wonderful as always.
Thank you so much. So just the first question to it's been, I think I last had you on the show maybe 2 or 3 years ago, and we'll explore some of those themes again. But first and foremost, what are you up to these days?
God, that's that's so hard to answer. I mean, there's a full-scale genocide that marches on in Gaza, and that weighs very heavily because I mean we are witnessing people literally starve to death, leave alone being blown up by bombs and so on. And things, and I think if you're following my khutbahs, you can see that things are constantly developing at that front. I mean, Netanyahu just recently said that he still believes in the Greater Israel thesis in an interview, and I gave a khutbah about that. The civil rights situation in the United States is very disconcerting, and as a law professor, that puts a considerable amount of pressure on me. Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, very recently said publicly that he is working to designate CARE as a terrorist organization. And that just and again I talked about this in a khutbah. You are talking about practically the only Muslim civil rights organization. It is a new chapter in authoritarianism and despotism to target a civil rights organization that works thoroughly within a commitment to the American system, to the constitutional principles of the United States, and a thorough commitment to the legal order within the United States, and then say, I want to designate this organization as a terrorist organization. That blows your mind. And, of course, and in the meanwhile, I am trying to find sufficient peace, sufficient tranquility to finish a scholarly project I'm working on that is rather very technical on the muhkam and mutashabih in the Quran. And that's, as I'm sure you know, when you are confronting these heart-wrenching real-life issues, genocide and civil rights violation of a living danger to our adopted homeland, to the country we immigrated to and became citizens of, and you see that danger in a very real way, and then to try to settle yourself sufficiently to work on a scholarly project that's, to use the expression that's academic, is quite a challenge. So I'm up to a lot of things, and sometimes I feel that's part of, I guess, the paradox and the predicament of all Muslim intellectuals is that while I'm up to a lot of things, sometimes I feel I'm up to nothing. Uh, so
Mm.
because of the sense of
No.
powerlessness that's rather overwhelming.
No, absolutely. And I think you laid out, I mean, we can see what's happening as the genocide rages on. We're seeing the mass starvation of a whole population streamed 4K. We're seeing the crises of capitalism bearing out just blatant fascism in the United States, right? And I think what was interesting in this moment, though, there was a hashtag that became popular, and it was called Islamo Curious, right? People were thinking, okay, how is that we can see so many Muslims become who are victims of US imperialism still remain so steadfast? But this is from people who will usually be identified on the left, and they would say, well, or they would, I guess, off repeat ad nauseum at times, but Marx said religion is the opium of the masses. I mean, we can talk about that being located within religion within Europe, in the history of Europe. But my question to you is, does Islam have revolutionary potential? And if so, how can we demonstrate this?
There is, unless you are going to put on thorough blinders and truly engage in aggressive self-deception, there is no way that you can study the life of the Prophet ﷺ. There is no way that you can study the emergence of Islam on the field, on the scene, without the conclusion that Islam is a revolutionary force. I mean, it's not every all the Abrahamic prophets. They received a message. The narrative is so occurs again and again in throughout all the Abrahamic prophets. They receive a message. They confront their people with the message. They're confronted with vehement opposition. Their message is about higher moral values of justice, equity, dignity, etc., etc., a rejection of hedonism and self-involvement and narcissism. That's basically, if you wanted to summarize what worshiping the one God is about, is that, okay, well, you are a servant and a servant of the one God, but you have dignity and pride and honor as vis-a-vis other human beings because they're not superior to you, they're equal to you. And the entire life of the Prophet ﷺ and all his disciples is basically, and we all learn this as babies, that there is, and once upon a time there was a place called Mecca, and Mecca was very corrupt, full of injustices. All types of horrible things happened by the elite in Mecca, inflicted horrible injustices upon the disempowered and the weak and the so on. And then the Prophet rebelled against that, and his disciples rebelled against that. And when we imagine this narrative, intuitively, we all learn what was the whole spiel of what Muhammad والسلام, brought to these people. Well, it was equity, justice, fairness, dignity, at the same time, humility, a rejection of nihilism, a rejection of narcissism, a rejection of oppression. And we all learn words like taghut. Oh, the Quran condemns taghut. Taghut is oppression, effectively, and condemns taghut, oppression, numerous times. And that is what the Muhammad and his disciples did, is that they rebelled against taghut and overthrew taghut and so on and so forth. Now, how do we get from that into the type of Islam, you want to call it Jami Islam, Madkhali Islam, Emirati Islam, Saudi Islam, Egyptian Islam, the Islam that is very well funded, very well supported, that basically neutralizes any affirmative, moral, ethical energy out of the Islamic message. So suddenly, the narrative becomes, well, yes, the Prophet rebelled against the injustices. Yes, the Prophet overthrew oppression, but it's sort of a Christianized Islam. It's like Jesus came to sacrifice his blood to bear our sins, basically to absolve us of our sins. Well, the Prophet rebelled back then to absolve us of the duty to rebel, or to absolve us of the obligation to take ethical stance forever. So it's as if his rebellion, 1400 years ago, was good enough forever. So now, in this sort of Christianized Islam, because it is really Christianized Islam. Okay, now that the Prophet rebelled and it's done with, you as Muslims today, all you have to do, according to Madkhali, Jami, Emirati, Saudi, Egyptian Islam, is basically to worry about your prayers and to worry about the hijab and to worry about your wudu, your ghusl, and so on, and that's it. And so any person that takes seriously the historical study of Islam cannot but come to the conclusion that Islam is a revolutionary force. And unless you are going to accept the thesis, very similar to Christianity, that the Prophet's rebellion was basically absolved humanity of the duty to rebel against injustice forever. The Prophet did it, so we don't have to do it. Khalas, it's done. Which is ridiculous because it has no theological basis whatsoever. And when you study the theological tenets of Jami Islam and Madkhali Islam, which is a very pacifist, very quietist, very obedient Islam to despots and dictators, you find that a remarkable amount of twisting the arms of historical narrative and historical precedent. And basically, when all is stripped of everything, it becomes very clear that the thesis is exactly the same. It's as if God sent the Prophet to rebel against injustice to absolve us forever of the duty to do so. And that's, in my view, that's a thorough obscenity. It's a complete, there isn't, what it leaves in its wake is a complete destruction of the Islamic faith. And not just the Islamic faith, but the entire Abrahamic legacy. Because the Abrahamic legacy is no longer about justice, is no longer about any higher principles that we human beings must commit to and aspire to achieve, but it is about basically absolving ourselves of the obligation to either pursue or even understand higher principles. And then that truly becomes religion, then does become the opiate of the people. And then that sort of traditional claim about religion becomes quite true, which is, just one last point on this. We all pass because of the impact of sectarianism and because the way sectarianism has been exploited by colonial powers, we all pass over is very significant historical reality. And that is, Allah willed that the grandson of the Prophet ﷺ, Imam Hussein, to sacrifice himself and some of the premier disciples of the Prophet at the time, ﷺ, for what purpose? This was not a historical accident. This was not something that occurred outside of God's will. The very purpose of that was to enshrine a moral lesson. It is, and we just all pass over it all the time as if nothing happened, as if the blood of the grandson of the Prophet is not extremely valuable for all of us, Sunni and Shia. It doesn't matter. Implying that, in fact, the Madkhalis and Jamis, I've attended lectures by Madkhalis and Jamis where basically they were implying that Al-Hussein was in error, that the reason that he died, Allah sacrificed his blood or allowed his blood to be sacrificed, is to teach us that rebellion is wrong. Really?
Subhanallah. No. And I think it's so interesting to me when I see an Islam that has capitulated to capitalism, that has emboldened the elites in their countries that have it's so ridden with oppression and oppressing the exploited masses that people say this is what Islam is, but it just seems so contradictory to what we see in the seerah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and especially through the story of Hussein. So thank you for, I think that's the greatest demonstration you could have given us to demonstrate the revolutionary potential of Islam. So my next question then is how do you understand or define justice, and what is the role of justice, adl, within Islam?
I just want to establish one thing that is, unfortunately, we all, again, when God subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions something in the Quran, it is sufficient that God would mention it once for us to take it very seriously. I mean, all that God needs to do to tell us that, for instance, stealing is wrong, is to say, don't steal. Or to condemn al-mutaffifun, people who cheat in trade, is to say it once. Or even when God wants to tell us the importance of fakku raqaba, of liberating people from their bondage, is to say it once. Because we, modern Muslims, have lost, and this is part of being a colonized people, is that we don't give credit to words. And we will often read a Quranic verse and just allow to pass over it as if God said nothing. And the assumption is, well, God didn't repeat it 100 times in the Quran, so we can overlook it. And that's a fallacy that's not taking God seriously. Now, I say this why? Because at the heart of the Quran, and not said once, but at the core of the Quran, is this obligation of al-qist and the repeated condemnation of al-dhulm. Qist is adl, is justice, and dhulm is injustice. And God makes it very clear to us that Allah does not love al-zalimun, that Allah does not love the unjust. So clearly, if you are part of a framework of injustice, if you are a supporter of injustice, if you accept injustice, if you legitimate injustice, you will meet God unloved. That's a horrible, horrible situation to be in. But we don't allow our imagination to go there because, again, our faith and our institutions, our Islamic institutions, are colonized. So we don't allow ourselves to be deeply offended by the very notion of injustice. Now, you raise a very important question. When Allah told us in the Quran that Allah wants us to be shuhada lillah qa'imin bil qist, that we bear witness for God and establish justice. And then in a different verse told us that Allah wants us to bear witness for justice and establish God's order, if you will. So equating God's order with justice. One saying that you are bearing witness, it's for God and establishing justice. The other is that you are bearing witness for justice and establishing God's order. Now, in this, and I think that the earlier Muslims, and this is what the people who built the Islamic civilization, the fact that it affected them and influenced them is what allowed them to make this civilization spring. Is it an invitation by God? Not just an invitation, it is an obligation that you must concern yourself constantly with what is justice. That has to be, and the thing about justice is, and any person that is honest about, or let's say not honest, but even any competent jurist can tell you that justice is a lifelong endeavor. You can never believe that you've achieved justice, but you must always pursue it, and you must always think very rigorously about it. It must become an obsession in your economic system, in your social systems, in your legal system, in every endeavor in life. You must pose that question: where is justice? And what is injustice? And when we read, especially in the first 5 centuries of Islam, we read what Muslim scholars wrote about the concept of justice, like reading a Qadi Abdul Jabbar, for instance, the thinking is so advanced, so sophisticated. You could not have generated this type of thinking unless justice was, you are thoroughly consumed by that normative endeavor. When you compare this to the lip service that modern Muslims give the very concept of justice, and in fact, a lot of people that I know will talk about Islamic law, and you discover that when it comes to the concept of justice, they've read nothing about it. They've really studied absolutely nothing. They imagine themselves a jurist without ever having read anything about theories of justice, philosophies of justice, the anthropology of justice, the sociology of justice. Earlier Muslims lived thoroughly in the epistemology of their age. We do not live in the epistemology of in our age. You cannot talk about justice in our day and age if you are not reading about justice within the modern epistemology, because the world has changed and the complexities that are, so it is, I cannot, and anyone, no one can generate a definition of justice. I mean, at the very basic level, I can tell you that justice must protect the dignity of a human being. And of course, dignity is, there is objective parts to it, and there are subjective parts to it. Dignity is in part a matter of perception and a matter of consciousness. I can tell you that justice, at a minimum, must struggle with notions of fairness and equity. And justice at a minimum, and this is that all human beings, from the moment of creation, not just human beings, by the way, but human beings, animals, plants, every living thing, comes to existence with a package of rights. Rights not to be harmed, rights not to suffer, rights not to be denied what the most basic elements for survival, and beyond survival for even, even when we all intuitively know that if you see a dog dying from thirst, it is justice to provide water to this dog. It is justice to save the life of this dog. If you sit by and allow this dog to die of thirst, you've committed an injustice. Serious struggling with notions of injustice means that you would take these penumbra of rights that attach to all living things, and the intricate processes of balancing between rights and obligations, and trying to achieve the maximum amount of rights without making any particular minority suffer an undue cost. So these are all, that's why our forefathers, our scholars would say that the pursuit of justice is ibadah. Talabul adl ibadah. That you are this, and they would say that it was a higher form of worship than any amount of rak'ahs and any amount. This type of thinking is what I find in modern Islam, and again, it is due to the type of the negating of this is so well funded, is so well supported by governments that have petrodollars, that basically try to create an Islam in which these basic intuitive notions are missing. But yet, if you're talking to any Muslim, intuitively, I mean, I have to believe that intuitively, they know that, it makes sense. Of course, if God is just, how can it be that God keeps telling us that God is just, and what God loves, you must love? And we all intuitively say, oh, God loves justice. But then you can just blissfully exist without worrying about justice? How does that make any sense?
Absolutely, absolutely. So something I've encountered, and I know you've encountered this, guy. I've seen some of your responses, but I think just for the audience, when I often send your videos and your lectures, people are usually definitely intrigued. Some agree, some disagree, but a lot of people find it to be a breath of fresh air. But I think a question that I'm often asked, and I know you are sometimes as well, is okay, so why is Shaykh Khaled so different though? What is his methodology? How is he arriving at his conclusions? What is motivating his thinking to give the fatwa and edicts that he gives? So if you can just tell our listeners, like, yeah, so why are you so different and what's your methodology? But again, I know that this is a question that you get, but I think it's important for some of us listeners.
Yeah. I mean, I have to tell you, Mamadou, what my experience has been, I want to say a few things about this because this is a really important point. When I was growing up, I didn't see myself as that different. I saw myself as the norm in the sense that, one of my teachers was Sheikh Muhammad al-Ghazali, for instance. And if you read the books of Sheikh Muhammad al-Ghazali, you can see Khaled Abou-Fadl in the writings of Sheikh Muhammad al-Ghazali in book after book after book. And people like Yusuf al-Qaradawi, who I didn't study that I just attended some classes with Sheikh Qaradawi, but again, it was Qaradawi would speak all the time about justice and about dignity and about Islam as a rebellion against injustice. But at the same time that we were very aware of luminaries like Sheikh Muhammad al-Ghazali and someone like Muhammad Imara, who would also, I was very close to Muhammad Imara, may Allah yarhamu, may Allah bless his soul. We were very aware that this is the type of Islam that was always at risk of ending up in prison. We were constantly at risk by Amn al-Dawla. And whether you were in Syria or Libya or Jordan or Egypt or Kuwait, you knew that even if they don't go after Muhammad Ghazali or Yusuf Qaradawi himself or Muhammad Imara himself, their students were at risk. And we were very aware of that. And so many of us ended up with horrendous, experiences that no human being should ever go through. At the same time, all of us were aware that this was in the 70s and 80s in particular, that so much money was being poured into supporting very different versions of Jama'at Islamiyah and supporting very different scholars. So all of us knew, for instance, that at the same time that there was a Sheikh Muhammad al-Ghazali, there was a Sheikh al-Bouti in Syria, who was saying very different things. So while we would learn that maqasid al-Sharia, one of the basic maqasid of Sharia is tahqiq masalih al-ibad, to achieve the welfare of people. And we would learn that the concept of maslaha is nonsensical without justice being at the core of it. And that by definition, you cannot talk about maslaha without talking about justice. We would be very aware that the students of Shaykh al-Bouti did not encouraged to think about justice. And the notion of maslaha was purely utilitarian. It was just, and it was as if a simple of maximizing utility, even if what was often described, or even if a minority had to be sacrificed for the welfare of the majority, that's fine, which is very antithetical to what we were studying from our shuyukh. But we also knew in the 70s and 80s that Saudi Arabia and the Emirat was pouring in tons of money into what eventually becomes Madkhali Islam, Jami Islam, what became the prevalent form of Salafi Islam. While even within the Salafi movement, there was the movement of Sheikh Ismail, who is now in prison in Egypt, that emphasized Islam as a rebellion against despotism. And while did not really embrace democracy in full, but clearly rebelled against despotism and saw despotism as a sin, and even Sheikh Ismail, I'm blanking out on his full name now, but anyway, people who know the Salafi movement will know who I'm talking about. I think it's Salah Abu Ismail or something like that. That even I in his classes, I remember that in this Sheikh's classes, he would talk about how Al-Imam al-Kawakibi wrote a book, and the book said that one of the kaba'ir, the grave sins in Islam, is al-istibdad, is despotism. And that people, you cannot talk about Sharia Sharia being about achieving the welfare of the people, tahqiq masalih al-ibad, without understanding what despotism is, and that despotism is a grave sin. But we also knew that within the Salafi movement, he ended up in prison. He was arrested in the time of Mubarak, and he was released after the revolution in Egypt, and then he was re-arrested at the time of Sisi and remains in prison. So even within the Salafi movement, there was an active and thrust to target people within the Salafi movement that condemned istibdad or despotism as a kabira min kaba'ir, as a grave sin, leave alone students of people like Sheikh Muhammad Ghazali and Qaradawi and so on. So what happened is the pendulum shifted, in which the Islamic activists who basically made Islam all about covering the hijab and the beard and the jalabiyya and the ruqya, and because that's a safe Islam, that was the safe Islam. They became the ones who did not go to prison. They were not chased out of their countries, were not silenced. What is remarkable is the period of the 90s was a deliberate indoctrination in cowardliness, in making Muslims scared. Now, you come to immigrant Islam even today, the prevalent norm, the prevalent psychological, sociological characteristic of Muslim capital and Muslim discourses is cowardliness. In order to move normative ethics forward, in order to explore justice, in order to explore equity, in order to explore even the concept of revolution or liberation, even liberation, you need capital. Without capital, movements die. And you need capital that celebrates investigation. Even if 50% or even more of these investigations amount to nothing, but you are investing in the possibility of originality and novelty, and you are basically saying, I am investing and you explore. That, especially as we enter the 21st century, completely dried up. And every Muslim intellectual that still had that passion, they had the only path to them that really became open is to join the Western academia, or and Western academia, as you know, is very well habituated with Orientalism, and basically forces you to moderate your discourse in a very different way than the way that in Saudi Arabia or Egypt or. So when people say, where did Khaled Abou-el-Fadl come from? The irony is that my ideas are thoroughly inspired by, and on one pole, at one extreme, is Ibn Taymiyyah, whose ideas are definitely revolutionary, but from the other pole, Qadi Abdul Jabbar, whose explorations of justice and the philosophy of justice are just, I'm often amazed at how some people claim that they read Ibn Qayyim Juzay, for instance. How can you claim to read him and then, because if you are reading the text and you've learned how to read the text, you see that whole revolutionary force in Islamic theology is well preserved there. And in fact, you have to work very hard to find texts in the Islamic tradition that reject the revolutionary force, the quietist type of Islam, the Jami Madkhali type of Islam. You have to work very hard to find texts that validate that orientation, as opposed to the orientation that tells you you can't accept injustice, you have to stand up against injustice, etc., etc. And so the sad thing is that I often feel that the Muslim masses have become brainwashed, and that although you find Muslims here and there that believe themselves to be original thinkers, analytical thinkers, critical thinkers, in fact, they many of them are quite young. They were born after the 80s. In fact, they don't realize the extent to which they are thoroughly a byproduct of neocolonialism and the despotic systems of government. So it's just mention this and then I'll keep quiet. Do you know that there is someone in social media? He's Egyptian. What he does is that he calls people from different parts of the Muslim world sort of haphazardly. He just calls people that are on TikTok, that are on Discord, and when he gets them on the phone, he first starts talking to them about nonsense, normal, but then immediately he starts talking about Gaza and how Gazans are suffering and so on and so forth. And whether he is calling someone in Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Libya, Iraq, Sudan, 90% of the time, the reaction of the people, the minute he starts talking about politics, Gaza, is they want to get off the phone. And he does this experiment. He lives in the United States, but he wants to show how the vast majority, although they sympathize with the Palestinians, they are the norm is to be scared and to not want to talk about. So on the one hand, I mean, do you know, recently I heard a khutbah from Gaza. This imam, must be the shortest khutbah in history. The imam got up and said, Ibadullah, people, I am starving and dizzy, and I know that you are starving and dizzy, so let's pray. And that was the entire khutbah. And yet, we all Muslims can experience something like this and turn around and say, okay, where's my dinner? And can you imagine if the Prophet was alive, والسلام, if he was alive today, and then people say, where does Khaled al-Fadl bring this from? All I do is imagine what the Prophet والسلام, would have done. What would the Prophet's position would have been? That's all.
Yeah, no, wallahi. And I think then, so like, if you were to like lay out or tell us or even just briefly describe your quote unquote your methodology when you give edicts and of fatwa, what would that be succinctly?
I mean, I would say this, that I've been trained that all laws have a purpose, and the purpose is to promote the welfare of people. Now, that Allah's commands, Allah does not demand what is unreasonable of us. So my methodology is a tafrij wa takhfif. That my methodology is to try to find a solution to solve a problem that people are confronting. I do not engage in suspended belief or false consciousness by denying the existence of the problem. I fully acknowledge the existence of a problem, and I have trust in Allah's Sharia that if I search and do my due diligence and do my homework and study methodically and thoroughly, that what Allah put this law as a trust in my hand as a jurist. And the trust is to solve people's problems, not to tell people, well, yes, I know that you have a problem, but I don't care. And it's basically your problem. It's like that is not the role of the jurist. And is it possible that I err? Of course it's possible, and that's why I'm always say I do my homework, I do my due diligence, but I constantly take very seriously that the purpose of Sharia is tahqiq masalah al-ibad, in the sense of achieving what is just and what is fair and what preserves the dignity of a human being and what honors a human being. Because to me, it is deeply offensive to me to think that as an American lawyer, that within American law, let's say, I would worry about the rights of people, or ideally, we worry about the rights of people, or we worry about people's well-being, that magical term, well-being. But that in Sharia, then Sharia becomes exactly what has happened to Sharia today. Is that, does Sharia really exist as a serious legal system? I mean, I'll give you one very quick example. The Pakistani Supreme Court recently, this is the Pakistani Supreme Court published its opinion, and they refer to my amicus brief. They contacted me and asked me to submit an amicus brief, basically an expert legal opinion on an issue of maintenance, that maintenance of a wife. And there was one solution, is to say no maintenance, the woman is owed nothing. The other solution was to say, no, you have to worry about the well-being of this woman who got a raw deal. And I spent the time going into the various legal opinions, including the earlier legal opinions. And as I advised the Pakistani Supreme Court, I said, well, here's the opinions of some of the most prominent jurists, which would result in a position that, in my opinion, does not do justice to this woman. But here are the opinion of other jurists who, in fact, would lead to a conclusion of doing justice to this woman. And I made a rational Sharia-based argument as to why a more just solution would be more consistent with Sharia. And this is, again, this was published by the Pakistani Supreme Court, so it's public information as of now. It's not. This is what the role of a jurist is, not to go to Chat GPT and act like I actually hear this from somebody say, oh, now with artificial intelligence, what is the role of a Muslim jurist? And I understand exactly where they're coming from, because if it's just simply regurgitating what exists on the surface, then you don't need Muslim jurists. Then you can, in fact, use artificial intelligence, and we all can go home. But that would be a betrayal of Sharia.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So speaking on some of these issues that require jurists and I guess newer ways to think about some of these issues, the last time you came on the show, you did a very brief commentary on the story of Lut, and you said that, this cannot be understood in the ways that his majority understand, the ways the majority understand the story of the issue of Islam and LGBTQ and queerness. And then you said at the time that you are looking forward to ethically motivated scholarship to look at this issue and advance it. But I often send that episode to people and they really enjoy that take. The only thing people come back and say all the time is that, but the verse is clear on the Quran. إِنَّكُمْ لَأْتُونَ رِجَالَ شَهْوَةً مِنْ دُونِ النِّسَاءِ. Verily you are people who have approached men lustfully, leaving women aside. That is so clear. There's no room for interpretation or understanding. How do you respond to that?
What was the sin of Qawm Lut? Because the very articulation, that very verse that you just cited, refers to Qawm Lut as people who, innakum, all of you. Now, there's a very logical question. So homosexuality is normally a minority of the people. And in fact, the clear majority would not be أتأتون الرجال شهوة من دون النساء. That the majority of the people would be heterosexual, and only a minority would be homosexual. But that was not the condition of Qawm Lut. Qawm Lut, we have an abnormal situation by if you lose the language, and the literal meaning of the language is that all of you guys, not some of you guys, all of you guys. And in fact, we know that Qawm Lut engage in a very bizarre social practice, that if there are any foreigners that come to the city, including the angels, that they violate them, they sodomize them. So is this akin to the way homosexuality had become in Rome, for instance, where even people who are not homosexual, it became sort of a normative ethics that you engage in sodomy as a way of proving your sexual valor and that you are a real strong man, that you can. We can all pretend that, oh, no, there's no difference between Qawm Lut and us today, or the situation that we're talking about, where a minority of the population is genuinely not attracted to a different sex. But that would be a make-believe, because everything we know about Qawm Lut is that, no, innakum, all of you guys. So what the Quran, by its literal meaning, is condemning is it doesn't answer the question of a minority of the population, specific individuals who are just not attracted to the opposite sex, and all the suffering and all the sense of worthlessness and the sense of the opposite of well-being, the sense of emptiness, the sense of hopelessness, the sense that attends to this. Now, what I really would wish for, I wished for a robust Muslim psychology because psychology is not my field, and a robust Muslim psychology that studies this. Imagine if Muslims actually did their own empirical studies, and imagine if Muslims actually can do empirical studies with objectivity and fairness, and then would start enlightening people like me, saying we are not under the influence of the Western trends, whatever they are. We are presenting our own Islamic research as to homosexuality. And here is what our research tells us. Then jurists can start taking this raw material, this empirical evidence, and because the Qawm Lut, again, it doesn't help me solve the problem, because the Quran condemns them for a very artificial situation of gross injustice and gross hedonism, where they are just, all of them, not a minority of the population, all of them are violating men and sodomizing men. Which, by the way, if you study ancient societies and so on, and the sexuality of ancient societies, there are very good books about sexuality in the ancient world, which gives you a very different perspective about the role of sodomy in particular in the ancient world, and how it was used as an instrumentality of power and dominance. So even men who were not actually homosexual, but they would be expected to sodomize the enemy. And I very much suspect from all the research that I've read that that's what the problem with Qawm Lut was, is that they were pigs. I mean, and so, but can you imagine if there was actually Muslim research and empiricism and investigations, and then I can actually, that would actually interview Muslims who identified as homosexual, and would inform scholars and jurists about it, and then our jurisprudence can start being real and genuine and authentic. But this you can't do law through this armchair guesswork. That's I mean, I myself, I grew up, of course, in I mean, it's very interesting. I grew up, of course, where it's completely not accepting homosexuality at any level. But at the same time, I would notice, especially the times I lived in Gulf countries, how a very different anthropological, sociological practice where the idea that you could be attracted to the man did not necessarily identify you as a homosexual, but was seen as sort of just as part of fitna, like something haram that it threatens everyone. And when I think back about this, I see a very different set of mores that, again, I cannot do as a jurist. I cannot do the empirical research that is needed to start deciphering the ways that native culture or indigenous culture is different than Western Victorian perceptions of sexuality. I know that there is a difference, but I do not have the means to actually explore this difference in a methodical, in a properly researched fashion. What bothers me is the way that Muslims, whether they are in support or against, always do things shooting from the hip as if they are not taking God's law seriously. Whether you are saying, oh, I defend it or I condemn it, without the demand for rigorous understanding. This is God's law. We have a very heavy responsibility. It is so easy for me to just take the stance, oh, I condemn everyone that has homosexual feelings. But I've seen failed marriages. I've seen people who suffer enormously because they have homosexual orientations, and it would be a betrayal of God's law for me to just ignore that and say, nope, your suffering doesn't exist, or I don't care about your suffering. If it was my law, yeah, I can do that, but this is God's law. God entrusted it to me. So, I mean, and again, I don't want, no scholar should be identified by a single issue, because all of us are human beings and we can be right or wrong. And as it's clear, my motivations is always to do right by God's law and to honor God's law and to not allow God's law to simply be associated with injustice and suffering. And especially when I see that I have not, as a human being who is entrusted by God's law, we have not done our homework. We have not done our research into what are the, what's the truth about this, and what's the reality, and what are the solutions. And to just tell people just suffer, is not acceptable to me. It in the same way that I cannot do unto others as you want done unto you, and I would not accept it from other people who just tell me just suffer. That I would not see that as fair or right.
No, absolutely, and I really appreciate that approach. Once again, many scholars don't want to do that work that you're talking about. So just finally then, we spoke a little bit about this when we spoke about justice, but I think, could you describe the ways in which colonialism and neo-colonialism has shaped Islam and the knowledge production of within Islam, and then also how we can get out of this? How do we decolonize?
This is really the toughest part, because do you know, and this again is under research, like so much in our tradition. One of the first things that colonialism did is target the Awqaf. I mean, we had an extensive network. All of us know that in every Muslim polity, I don't want to use the word nation, but in every Muslim polity, the reality of wherever you went, from Cairo to Damascus to Baghdad to Timbuktu to wherever, there is an extensive network of Awqaf. And the Awqaf supported Islamic projects that ranged from taking care of orphans to taking care of animals to taking care of irrigation and waterworks to taking care of education and the production of knowledge. And the Awqaf supported the zawiyas, supported the madrasas, supported the whole And the first thing that colonial powers did was target the awqaf and control the purse and control the ability to dispense funding towards projects. And basically, by doing so, you made everything centralized and everything dependent. And remember that for the colonial powers, the word murabitun, or what was the word they used to use for a Sufi? The dervish was a feared person for colonialism, because the dervish, they understood that the dervish was always funded independently, and the dervish didn't fear death, and the dervish always rebelled against colonialism. So again, back then, Sufism was associated with rebellion and with rejection and with anti-colonialism. And so systematically, you can study this from France in Algeria, to the Italians in Libya, to Dutch colonialism, to German colonialism, to placate and control the Sufi tariqas by controlling the purses. And when colonialism left, what they left us with is a practice of, now it is their agents, the governments they put in power, controlling the awqaf. So we all know that now, today, all the awqaf are controlled by despotic, corrupt governments. All the ministry of awqaf are always the most corrupt ministry in any Muslim country, to the extent that there are no awqaf anymore. I mean, the awqaf are pillaged and stolen and corrupted. No Muslim in their right mind dies today and leaves a waqf, because they know what the fate of the waqf will be. It will be pillaged by the despotic governments in power. What that meant was that to the production of Islamic knowledge and the production of Islamic institutions became dependent completely, thoroughly, on governments, on states. And that's, by the way, why so many of these Muslim governments despise the Ikhwan. I'm not, I was never a member of the Muslim Brotherhood, but just as from a scholarly perspective, why? Because the Ikhwan created networks of independent funding. They didn't, unlike many of the Salafi movements or many of the Sufi movements, they didn't just accept governmental funding for their existence, but rebelled against that and tried to create networks of independent funding. That has meant that the form of Islam that you see today, the death of Islamic institutions, because the madrasas became financially starved. All you need to do is go to Azhar today. And is this the premier seminary in the Muslim world? Even just the physical, the only good-looking part of Azhar is where Shaykh al-Azhar is, his office, or the office of the Mufti, and that's by governmental money. But the signs of deterioration are everywhere. So we are not going to start because let's be real. You are not going to start reclaiming a civilization or coming out of a spiral of deterioration through the generation of good ideas. It is not the problem is not the existence of good ideas. And that is why the Quran, as I said, all God needs to do is mention something once to tell us how important it is. But see how many times the Quran emphasizes that infaq fi sabilillah, that you spend. And in this, because God is telling us, no idea, no institution, no normative dynamic can ever exist without funding, without the actual financing of a project. And Muslim capital as it exists now is very cowardly. It's not that the money doesn't exist, it exists. But the same dynamic, Muslims become wealthy. Once they become wealthy, they become cowardly. And that is where I believe, are stuck. I mean, look at the impact that the Ismaili Institute, that is very well funded, was created in England, has had in getting the world to pay attention to the Ismaili Fatimi tradition. Yes, it's at an academic level, but just that amount of money was able to rehabilitate so much that was forgotten. Nothing even remotely close to that exists for Muslims. That sort of professionalism, that sort of independent funding, and generating the funds and saying, go without restrictions, do your investigations, do your studies, I really, yani, one, of course, Allah can change anything and everything overnight. But that's Allah's business. That's not my business. My business is to use rational means, to think rationally, not to wait and hope for a miracle. That is to start thinking in terms of the miraculous and to hope for a miracle. That's transgressing upon Allah's bounds. That's Allah's business. If Allah wants to present a miracle tomorrow, Allah can. But what Allah charged me with is to use rational means, reason, causality. And what causality tells me is that no human project in history ever went anywhere without the existence of adequate funding. I mean, think of any revolutionary movement, and without those who are willing to sacrifice and say, I am spending and I am giving the resources. So those who can research will do their job. Those who can think will do their job. Those who can commit their life to activism and social activism and social movements can do so. Because if you are an inspired social activist and you have to worry about paying your bills and making a living, all your talents and all your gifts will be completely consumed in nonsense, and you will amount to nothing. What you or I or any person with any particular gifts need is to be unleashed, and we cannot be unleashed unless you have some level of support. And that's where I believe we are, and that's at least my experience of life has shown me and has taught me, because I've seen, people, scholars, even, I mean, without naming names, but there are a number of scholars even that exist today that are generating very good thought, but they're thinking and it goes nowhere. Even their books are read by such a small amount of people, because you need funding to teach that thought, to investigate and explore and build upon that thought. You need to fund students who would dedicate themselves to absorbing that thought and then developing upon and building upon that thought. Yeah, that's Allahu Alam, but that's yeah.
We have our work cut out for us indeed, but thank you so much for this enlightening conversation once again, Sheikh. And I encourage my listeners once again, as I always do, to check out the Sheikh's work on the Usuli online on YouTube. And until next time, Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam.